Hello and welcome to the next lesson. We are talking about the crooked and curved fingers. Now, ideally, fingers should be straight. When you imagine looking at someone's hand, you don't expect to see a curved finger. A straight finger depicts a steadiness of the flow of the characteristics that comes with that finger. So basically, that is the ideal shaped hand, but it's not always the case. And quite often there is curvature of a finger, and that shows a variation to the qualities that the finger represents. So it just slightly leans to one way or another. Sometimes the finger is actually held in a way that it leans away from, so the finger is actually straight, but it just leans or clings to another finger. So that's slightly different meaning. We'll talk about that. So the leaning itself represents what is current now, what the person is kind of going through right now, rather than something from the past. And what I mean something from the past is if the finger is curved, that means it's happened gradually over a period of time, and in most cases at a young age for that person. So the basic leaning of the finger shows that it's giving up some of its strength to another finger, and we'll explain that. When it's curved throughout its entire length, that's slightly different. It's gaining strength from the straight finger. And the finger that has another leaning or bent towards it, the straight finger, shows that is where the greatest attributes are. For instance, hello and welcome to the next lesson. We are talking about the crooked and curved fingers. Now, ideally, fingers should be straight. When you imagine looking at someone's hand, you don't expect to see a curved finger. A straight finger depicts a steadiness of the flow of the characteristics that comes with that finger. So basically, that is the ideal shaped hand, but it's not always the case. And quite often there is curvature of a finger, and that shows a variation to the qualities that the finger represents. So it just slightly leans to one way or another. Sometimes the finger is actually held in a way that it leans away from, so the finger is actually straight, but it just leans or clings to another finger. So that's slightly different meaning. We'll talk about that. So the leaning itself represents what is current now, what the person is kind of going through right now, rather than something from the past. And what I mean something from the past is if the finger is curved, that means it's happened gradually over a period of time, and in most cases at a young age for that person. So the basic leaning of the finger shows that it's giving up some of its strength to another finger, and we'll explain that. When it's curved throughout its entire length, that's slightly different. It's gaining strength from the straight finger. And the finger that has another leaning or bent towards it, the straight finger, shows that is where the greatest attributes are. Sometimes it's only the very tip bent. That's when it can get a little bit more confusing, because you don't see that very often at all. That actually gives a slightly bigger meaning to it because it seems more harsh. And it's usually only on the Jupiter or the Mercury finger. Very rare cases it's sharply bent on the middle or the ring finger. The meanings will be similar, however. So on the mercury, on the pinky, it can show an early history of family problems. On the index finger, it can show some kind of mental confusion in the decision making, in the thoughts, or the way things are perceived. So the values would have changed from the early years for that person. Often again, a history of problems with the parents, maybe not being in agreement with each other, not necessarily every case, but it's just an example of a typical case where the parents are either divorced or they fight or disagree a lot. So that person with the bent tip would have needed to grow with a new understanding and like a practical mindset to forgive their parents or understand the situation more. So it's bending towards the maturity of Saturn. They might have had to mature at an early age. So the Jupiter finger bending towards the Saturn finger can belong to a person who was a shy child. They may have struggled with communication or independence. They may have had to depend on others, especially family, during, for instance, the younger teenage years. They were quite dependent. They needed the security of the family. And in general, they might, in life, need the security of a partner or their career, for instance. So generally, it can denote some form of insecurity, and often due to possibly a history of poor economic times, the family might not have had a lot. However, frequently these people grow up to be very self-assertive because the index finger being all about the ego and the self, that's leaning towards the Saturn of all about responsibility. So it's getting more responsibility from Saturn. So they can be quite determined achievers. They can persistently work towards their goals and have a very dutiful outlook on life. So they have a duty. If they're a mother, they have a duty to being a mother. If they are in their career, they feel the duty to do their career well. Now, this is particular if the Saturn finger tip also has a curve. If they both have a bit of a curve, that shows what I was talking about before. So the person might have had some problem in the growing years, like regarding the parents. So as they became an adult, they might have gained a measure of rational thinking. So the rational is coming from the Saturn. So the rational thinking matched the mature mind and a better understanding of the parents. So in a psychological sense, you wouldn't just look at the hand and say, oh, you had bad parents. It's not exactly what I'm trying to say. It's just that the person would have gradually seen and understood in a rational way on what has happened, and basically leans towards a very rational thinking mind. A little bit more about the index finger, the Jupiter finger. When the whole finger curves towards the Saturn, it can also show that in relationships, this person is prone to be emotionally secretive. They will feel a little bit unstable, hence the insecurity. So they can potentially expose a possessive or jealous type of nature, specifically in relationships. So the Saturn finger, ideally the Saturn finger should be straight. shows self-control and responsibility. When it's bent, the boundaries and beliefs may be a little bit out of the ordinary. The person might not have such strict rules for themselves or routine, and maybe their decision making is a little bit complicated. They might ask for the opinion of others before they make decisions. That is, when the middle finger bends towards the ring finger of Apollo, the qualities of Saturn are favoring towards the creative aspects. The creative aspects of the Apollo, the ring finger. So these people might need time to be alone, like a creative person often does. It can suggest history of uncertainty, such as depression or pressure from family duties. The family duties might have clashed with their search for their self-expression or achievement in a creative type situation. So the middle finger is kind of like being the boss of the creative finger, and it is, whilst it's giving it some energy, the person is getting more seriousness through the creativity, but at the same time it can hinder the self-expression in some cases. Usually once the person becomes aware that they holding back their expression, and that opens them up to then coming out and not doing it anymore. A little bit more here. When all the fingers bend inwards towards the Saturn finger, that adds some shrewdness to the character. So they may have a bit of a distortion of reality, which may lead to corruption or unlawfulness, especially if the Saturn finger is short. Going to the ring finger now. Apollo represents creativity and expression. A curve on this finger is an indicator of it gaining qualities and strength from the other. It is a typical feature on writers and artists. When the Apollo finger bends toward the Saturn finger, it shows that seriousness and responsible nature is active and being expressed through the creativity. You can see in this image, the Apollo is leaning away from the Saturn, and it seems to only do it from the second knuckle. So it's run straight and then just sort of kicks out from basically from the base knuckle, base phalange, and then the top two knuckles kick out. So if the Saturn finger also curves towards the finger, the creative expression may have been limited despite talent being present, like I mentioned before, possibly due to family responsibilities or commitments. So talking about that Apollo finger leaning away from Saturn, like in the previous picture, that implies the opposite, which is a quiet personality and usually limited or unusual expression of their creativity. Also, leaning away from Saturn, these people might prefer to live alone rather than deal with other people. It's a sign of more of an eccentric personality, same as the Mercury finger. So in general, if the Apollo finger leans away from Saturn or leans away from the thumb, it shows a fussy, pedantic person. especially about things that are important to them. It might come across as compulsive, like some things don't matter and some things do matter. So an instance of that would be they don't care if they're not wearing matching socks. However, if they have dust on their car, they're crazy about keeping the car free from dust. So that kind of thing. So some things are compulsive and other things are just not important. Okay, now the last one, the bent pinky, mercury finger. That relates to how we communicate. So when it gently curves towards the Apollo finger, it's gaining strength from it. So it's not a bad sign. It indicates a higher level of shrewdness and alertness and a tactful way of speaking. These people do have an awareness of others and a natural ability to communicate in a diplomatic way. They can make smart business people or very convincing salesperson, probably due to their charm and ability to bend the truth. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're a liar. That bent pinky is traditionally known as someone who's a liar, but it's more like a skill of diplomacy. So that if they did lie, well, they could do it well, but they actually just try not to hurt someone's feelings. So they are potentially saying what somebody wants to hear. If also with a short middle finger, the Saturn finger, it's a sign of someone who might have a tendency to pilfer. They probably get excited about the fact if they're able to take something and didn't have to pay for it. Okay, on the mercury finger, continued. If the tip only is curved, they will be good at consoling others. A sharp kink, though, usually bending towards the Apollo finger, can suggest some history of either emotional abuse or some kind of trauma. For instance, when there has been a separation of the parents and the child might have suffered loss or sadness. Usually that would happen before the age of, say, 11. If the mercury finger bends or leans away from Apollo finger, that is when there is like a hint of eccentricity. They're a very eccentric person, someone who doesn't like to follow trends. They will be assertive and independent. Again, leaning away from the other fingers, that's showing somebody who likes to be on their own. They're not particularly fussed if they don't have people around them a lot. Now, a little bit of a summary about someone being an extrovert. I've got some notes here on this image. Mercury finger leaning towards Apollo, showing that Mercury is active. So they have a sharp and diplomatic mind. They're charming and perceptive, but they can be deceitful or cunning. A sharp bend suggests a history of emotional issues. With the ring finger, shows someone creative, but a serious nature and a need for security and dependence. There may be a history of difficult economic times. So these are all the fingers leaning towards the thumb. And showing extroversion comes from when they lean or bend towards the thumb. The energy is in the direction of the active conscious. Like in the early lessons, we talked about the conscious, subconscious, the mind and body areas of the hand. So it's indicating a more extroversion or more influence the subject that the finger represents. So a stronger quality. If all the fingers readily wide open in a relaxed state, so that depicts independence, friendliness, self-confidence, open-mindedness, maybe an unconventional personality. But the more open the hand is, the more open the personality. Basically, if someone just tucks all their fingers in and reluctant to open their fingers, that shows very closed and potentially shy personality. So up here, again, Saturn leaning towards the thumb shows outgoing, extroverted, and ambitious. They might enjoy the company of other people, but they might be emotionally reserved. And the Jupiter finger leaning towards the thumb specifically depicts a very independent and highly ambitious nature. Someone who likes to be in the center of attention. Outgoing, lively, social, often an eccentric or ostentatious type personality. Loud, in other words. And the more the thumb leans away from the hand, the more extroverted and open-minded the person as well. Summary of the introvert. With the fingers tending to lean away, if all of them are leaning away, the energy is in that direction of the inactive subconscious side, indicating the introversion. So it can denote a reluctance to lead or demonstrate authority. They might also be just too shy to do it. If the fingers are held close together, like before I mentioned, it shows caution, reservation, suspicion, or secretiveness. So they are secretive instead of being open. And with the thumb held close to the hand or curving towards the hand, that shows a modest, cautious person. They can be bound by their habits and have an unadventurous spirit. They're often intelligent, but they can be miserly or selfish. With the Jupiter leaning away from the thumb, that shows introverted, shy personality, insecure in relationships. They can be stubborn, but also dutiful and respectful, like I mentioned earlier. Revealing their true self can be difficult. The Saturn leaning towards the Apollo suggests things are taken less seriously. There may be a history of uncertainty and reserved emotions, maybe even depression, but making decisions are not as easy. The shy, quiet personality of the Apollo leaning away from Saturn. These people can have unusual taste in their style. They might be reclusive and fussy. And the summary of the Mercury leaning away depicts an assertive and independent nature. They're often seen as eccentric or one who does not care about the rest of the society. If the finger just widely outward, there may be current worry over emotional issues. And that is the end of lesson 7. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I look forward to doing another one for you shortly. Thanks very much.